Hey there, Wargamers. Austin here with Death Ray Designs, and here on the first day of Christmas, we bring you Sculpting with Stencils. So when you sculpt with stencils, we're talking about pressing texture into putty or some other soft material that you're going to be putting onto your model. In this situation, we want to add a stucco effect onto the side of our building. So much like a plaster wall that goes on over brickwork that you might see crumbling away and exposing the brick over time, we want to find something a little bit more cohesive with the theme of this building. Since it's so high-tech sci-fi, we don't want to have just standard stucco or plaster on the wall. We want to do something a little bit more creative. So today we're going to use our hex stencils and press in a hex pattern plaster on top of one of these walls. First, we're going to mix up some of our epoxy putty. Depending on how large the surface is that you're trying to cover, you'll need more or less putty. Also, if you're trying to fill up to a particular rim or anything, you may need more or less depending on that. So let's cut off a little chunk here. This epoxy putty, much like green stuff that you may be familiar with, is a two-part epoxy, but instead of it being side by side like green stuff is, this is one wrapped around the other. So it's kind of like those little, cream candy things. So you just got to get the plastic off the outside, and if this is the first bit, there's always some foil or something on the end here. Let's see if we can get that off. And then we just start mixing it up. So we're just going to keep mixing until we have a consistent color. For some of these putties, it's a little difficult to see when you're done just because the two colors of the epoxy are so similar to each other even to begin with. So, all right, so now we're all mixed up and we're going to select the wall on our building that we want to put this on. This wall right here is the one that we're planning on applying this technique to. I think that it's a nice open surface. It's still got some detail behind it that will look nice when it's partially covered. And generally, I like to do this technique on something that's got an upper lip on it, just so that it hides that top edge. So we're going to take a piece of our putty right now and sort of fill in this area over here. I'm thinking that we'll apply mostly here and then put our texture down, and then we'll do some chipping on the other side to transition it over to that surface. So we're just going to push this into place. Generally, I like to keep a cup of water on hand because this putty can get a little bit sticky. You don't want to get too much water on your MDF because it can deteriorate the MDF. But as long as you keep it on the putty, it should be pretty good. All right, let's add a little more down here. And if you find that it's just really, really sticky, waiting a minute or so after you've mixed it up is usually a good way to eliminate some of that. Okay, so we've got it generally where we want it, and we're going to start sort of pushing it out so that it covers a little bit more area. We don't need it to cover up the whole thing because we want this to look somewhat crumbled and ruined. Okay, all right, so now we have a pretty uneven surface at this point. So we're going to try to even this out with some tools, and we can use a variety of sculpting tools or little rollers to try to do that. So we're going to take some of our steel dental tools here and keeping them wet so they don't stick to the putty, I'm going to try to force it down into the cracks and crevices here, and also kind of scoop away a little bit of it at the edge so that we don't have it going up and over onto that next plane. So, there we go. Starting to clean that up a little bit. And you can see down here in the corner, that's a spot that I missed when I was pressing it in. It's always good to look at these things from multiple angles just so that you can see if you're missing anything on the undersides of lips or anything. Okay, so let's get a little more water on our tool. I'm going to try to just sort of smooth everything out. This doesn't have to be crazy 100% smooth, but getting it close is definitely a plus. So now that we've got our putty down, we're going to put our stencil on. So you can select a variety of different stencils, but I think this one fits the bill a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of press this in place just to get it tacked down. You can do this by hand, or if you've got a rolling pin and it's a more accessible sort of flat surface, that may do the trick a little better for you. I'm going to try to get this to fold into all of the corners that I can, and I'm always keeping one finger down on it because you don't want it to shift, because then you'll end up sort of getting a double image. That's not what you want. So make sure that we get all of this pressed in, at least at some point. Some of this is going to try to pop back out on you, but don't worry about it. As long as it makes the impression at least once, we're good. If you need a little help, you grab a tool, preferably something a little bit rounded, and press down into corners. Okay. Alright, so let's do one more pass here and just make sure that we are well into the material. Okay, now let's peel this off and see how we did. Now we have a little bit of waiting to do. We've applied our putty, we've put the texture in, and now we've got to wait for it to dry so that we can chip up the edges and make it look like it's pulled away from the substructure. When you do this on your terrain, you may want to do it as part of your assembly process. Doing it before the model is completely assembled is going to make it so much easier to get into some of the nooks and crannies and details, especially if you've got multiple layers that you want to avoid rolling all over. So now our putty is set, and it's time to start carving the edges to make them look a little more chipped up. So we've got a couple of tools here. We've got a couple of knives and a chisel. You don't really necessarily need a chisel, but it might make it easier for certain applications. So let's get started. Okay, so one of the things that we want to do here is bevel these edges. So we're going to come in here, start chipping away at the edges so that we don't have this rounded sort of look anymore. And having broken pieces is only going to add to the effect. So if you are using a chisel, some of the stuff that you can do is getting more like plunge cuts in here, which you probably still can do with a knife, but it's just a little easier with a chisel. Like I said before, fracturing is actually good here. You want this to look as sort of organically crumbly as possible. So you can see here that we've still got some like partial tiles. It's not that we need to eliminate all of these, but gouging in on areas to make it look like whole tile pieces or whole chunks of it along those lines have popped out is probably a good idea. So let's take our chisel here. We're going to work on that section first. I'm just kind of prying out pieces as I go. Like I said, you don't have to plunge all the way down to the level of the MDF. In fact, the more multi-layered you can make it look, the better. So now we've got this chunk missing and it looks more like it broke along the lines of the plaster. But we're continuing to sort of carve out some of the tile areas here the best that we can, like I said. Okay, so we've also got this very sort of clean line going around. I think that we should probably break that up a little more. So let's pick out some of this, because it's not going to perfectly ramp up into this surface. So I think coming in and making some little notches to make it break a little bit more organically and unevenly is going to be a thing we want to do. And realistically, I'm just sort of pressing in and it's fracturing generally where it wants to, wherever there's a weakness in the plaster. So we're getting a much more realistic break here, just because it's breaking like plaster probably would. In this situation, we've done a pretty simplistic approach to this, where we've just had it on one side. You could very easily have also put putty in some of the other corners and made it look like it definitely went all the way to this other wall in its previous incarnation before it started falling apart. I think it's also really important to cut out little sections in the middle that sort of break up the plainness of it. If we've got all of this damage on the sides, maybe some of this over here also has been damaged by whatever took this plaster out. One of the other pieces that you could do is use a textured paste along this edge to try to blend it in so that you still have some of the residue of whatever this sci-fi plaster material is bleeding over onto the edge of the MDF, and maybe pack it into some of the corners around, just so that you get a more even transition of texture between this, this tile and the substructure. So now this is just the starting point of what you can do with these techniques. We've done a sci-fi version of this with a hex pattern, but you could easily do some type of diamond tile with our Harlequin stencils, or take any of our icon stencils and have a raised sculpture off of a base that you're working on, or the side of a building, or even a vehicle with this technique using putty and pressing stencils in. You could also potentially do multiple layers of stencils to get interesting and different effects. The sky's the limit here, and this is just the beginning of this project. We haven't even put paint on it yet, and there's tons of techniques that you can use to really bring that to life. Check out our episode tomorrow where we're going to be talking about painting MDF terrain with just rattle cans. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope maybe you learned something. You can check out the products that we use for the 12 Days of Christmas series on the website at deathraydesigns.com/12days. We hope you go check it out. Until next time, happy working.